Welcome to another episode of the Hitchhiker's Guide to Recruiting. I'm Marc Dobkin. I'm joined here by Cory Kazmersky. I'm a hiker and backpacker. Cory recently lived the nomadic lifestyle while traveling the country, and this is our monthly series where Cory and I guide you through exploring the landscape of job and employee search terrains. We're actually joined here today by a special guest, our colleague Drew. Just wanted Drew to join our show here today because you recently lived sort of a van lifestyle, I guess. So it kind of relates to this show here. And yeah, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your travels recently across the country, Drew.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to be here. So thanks for having me join as a first guest.
Thanks for having us,
Of
Um,
Drew.
course. Mhm.
yeah. So my name is Drew. I am on our go-to-market team. I work specifically with a lot of like sales recruiting. And yes, as Marc said, I similarly to Cory, I like to say like we city hopped a lot. We do have a van. So I would say, maybe not full-time van, but we have stayed in it extensive amounts of time. It's gets a little difficult when you and your partner are both on client meetings, stuff like that. But yes, have traveled all across the US, even into different cities in Canada. I love to go hiking and skiing too, so with it, getting to like snow weather, I'm excited about that. So I think that's why we did a lot of Canada too, catching a lot of those areas. But yeah, so have kind of done it all. Big adventurer, especially kind of moving into remote life when COVID hit. There's a lot of people that travel abroad, and when you're abroad, you go to so many different places because you don't know the next time you're going to be back, right? But you keep telling yourself you're going to do that in the US, and do you? So we kind of just took advantage of that. So yeah, that's kind of my little background into adventuring, traveling across the country. I would not recommend having two cats in a van, but we've done it. Yeah. So that's a little bit about me, though.
Oh, that's great. That's why we love you, Drew, because you love adventuring just like us. But Cory,
Absolutely.
you were kind of doing a similar thing. So, what are some of the sort of similarities between what, as far as your adventures go, and Drew's?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think, part of it is, like Drew said, just kind of city hopping. A lot of what we do is different cities every, 3 weeks to a month. We're in a different Airbnb. We haven't done the, you know, transfer to the van life yet, but, who knows, maybe one day. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of similarities and just, you know, having those sometimes tight quarters, you never really know what you're going to get from an Airbnb from city to city. So, we've stayed in places that have plenty of space for us to spread out, and we will never hear each other on the other side of the house, or sometimes we're in like a one bedroom apartment where we're screaming over each other on client meetings. So I can definitely understand some of those similarities from that standpoint.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. It sounds like you guys learned to handle conflict in tight spaces, right? And traveling with your partner and being with them 24/7 most of the time. So, you know, it, Drew, you had mentioned something about
Yeah.
the difficulty of taking like client meetings with your partner in such close quarters. And Cory, you sort of finding a quiet place to take meetings and things like that. So, I'm really interested in hearing about what it's like living in close quarters with somebody and the difference of opinions you might have and different triggers and things like that and how you handled them.
Yeah, I think that's always tough. Everyone's different. I think, even when we're in, conversations, I think that is something that we often forget to mention. So sometimes when I see like we're having a difference of opinions, I'll say, "Hey, we're different people. We have different needs or we have different thoughts on something. Let's first just like make that be known." And so we're not getting, very heated about a conversation. But yeah, I think in general it is, very difficult to be traveling because you're thinking about so many different things on top of like your work that you have to like coincide with. But yeah, there's always going to be difference of opinions. Like we, and probably Cory, you can, share your side of this, but like when you're city hopping or like, driving to so many different areas, you're like, oh, well, what if we went this way? And then that could lead us into going to this city and then that city and then going there. Or if you go south more and then you're going to be hopping into a different, like this direction. So I think there's always going to be a difference of opinions in that regard of like which way, like what's going to be our best, like long-term option here. And then obviously like working in close quarters too, there's a very big communication factor. So like, making sure that when you have a very important meeting, you're making sure the other person knows that so that they can kind of make sure that they're not, tinkering around somewhere and making noise. But yeah, I think those are just a couple of things that definitely stand out is like everyone's gonna have a difference of opinions on something. There's no right or wrong either because we're all different people. And then there's always gonna be like working against the importance of a client meeting or a candidate call or something like that. Like where is the priority on these? Like who has the important meeting that they need to like push before the other person and communicating with that individual. So those are things that like stick out to me.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, who knew that you'd come onto our show and actually provide some marriage advice as well?
Yeah.
That's great advice there, Drew.
Yeah,
Actually, like,
agreed.
yeah, brings us to the topic of this episode. Actually, we wanted to specifically focus on interview questions and more so conflict resolution. And what I mean by that is like those type of questions that you typically hear in interviews. Like, can you provide me an example of a time when you handled conflict with a coworker, and how did you handle it? Or how do you approach resolving conflicts within a team? Another question might be, how do you handle disagreements with your supervisor or manager? Any other sort of questions along those lines that you guys can think of that you might hear in interviews?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are two, really common ones, Mark. I think, to even make it more broad, something, along the lines of like, why did you leave your last company? And I feel like there can be a lot of conflict issues behind, those questions at times. So, not even as specific, but in a more generalized way, those questions can come out one way or another in an interview. And I think it's important to learn how to handle those.
Mhm.
Yeah. And just like Cory said, that's a big one because obviously that gets asked almost every time, by recruiters, agency, and then internally as well. The sales part in me thinks of when someone doesn't hit a quota, like how did you overcome that? Like what was the result? What did you do after that? So thinking of that again, like that long term of that, or like tell me about a time that you had a negative client experience and how you might have turned that into a positive. Like what did you learn from that? Like that's what interviews are truly trying to understand is like the learning component of it, or from like a personality standpoint, like how best do you approach things, like making sure you're thinking things through, stuff like that. But yeah, I guess like if I were to answer some of these questions though, I'll be pretty broad here though, and then maybe Cory or Marc, you can kind of like chime in too, of course. But again, I'm going to be repetitive here when I say it's always important to take into account someone else's feelings. So Marc, when you're talking about conflict resolution, take into account someone else's feelings. Some people it's it comes naturally, some people it doesn't. So just take a pause for a second before reacting. Acknowledging really does wonders. When you're in conversations and the other person kind of gets a little heated, it's because they're not really acknowledging what the other person said and they might be confused. So just like take a second. I think with answering a lot of these though, really important to have good stories prepared.
Mhm.
And when you're talking about those stories, giving an example, it's going to hold a lot more weight. So making sure that you're really not talking too much about that negative before you start to talk about the positive. And I don't mean like lie, and I don't mean don't talk about it at all. Like obviously they're going to want to know that there was a negative component there, but just be very brief with it. Let's say answering Cory's question about like leaving a company. Don't say you got into like a rift with like HR or something. You can talk more, generally like there were leadership changes, there were commission changes, things kind of like that, and just keep it as is. Like They don't need to say like with a leadership change, like, oh, I was really struggling with my manager doing this, that, or the other. You can just say there were leadership changes, and if they of course want more detail, like that's something that they're asking for. But if they don't, then why lead into it? I think is important there. And then also don't talk to like too negatively about your company in general. I think there are instances where people think, maybe you're at a direct competitor, and they really want to make sure they're relaying to that other company they're interviewing with that they're super serious about something. And they're talking all this negative stuff about that company. But to the company that you're interviewing with, they might in their head be like, is this person just a negative person? They just might have some question marks there. So again, just keep it like super, super brief in terms of why you're leaving. Don't be too negative because that can also hurt you too. But that's very broadly. And Cory, I don't know if you have more specifics to go into there too.
Great advice.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think you make, some really good points there. I think going back to, the point you made earlier about just some of your travels and being in close quarters, I think it is important. Like if you are answering these questions and even just in general, like having a conflict at work, like that open communication and just saying like, hey, look, we are two very different people, let's just kind of chat this out rather than like get heated. Like, hey, I know things are escalating. Let's tone this down a notch and, really, hear each other out here before things progress too far. But yeah, I mean, in an interview setting, you definitely never want to talk negative. And, I think another thing that a interviewee might be thinking is like, hey, like if they leave our company, like, is this how they're going to talk about us as well? Like, you never want that,
Right.
Bad publicity from a candidate when they're interviewing somewhere else in the future. But no, I mean, I think you've hit, kind of all the points, exactly right. And, there are going to be different questions depending on what kind of roles you're interviewing on. And I think, having that prepared answer, and just kind of delivering it with confidence is going to be, one of the most important aspects on an interview. If you're kind of fumbling around your words, like it's going to come off like you might not be telling the full truth or something like that. So you definitely want to be like confident in your delivery, even if it is negative, because, again, like you might get asked some probing questions and some things are going to come out, but, don't hone in and take too much time on those negative aspects of what you've been asked, but, turn that into, how you turn the conversation into a positive or the conflict into a positive and get it resolved. I really love that point.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
to that point, I think it's super important to address the question, answer it honestly, but always, pivot it into a positive conversation and, how you handled it positively and what was the positive outcome of that. Well, great advice. This was really insightful. Drew, thank you so much for being on our show. Really appreciate it. It's been great having you here, and hopefully you'll want to come back on our show in the future.
yeah, I'm happy to be here, and happy to, maybe we should share some stories ourselves and really bring it home. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, as we wrap up another episode of the Hitchhiker's Guide to Recruiting, keep in mind that the lessons from the trail can guide you to success. Stay curious, stay adaptable, and remember, every step counts.